terror target. The U.S. military is looking into claims by the Russians that they killed the leader of ISIS. U.S. policy shift. How President Trump is rolling back on Obama-era rules regarding the U.S. and Cuba. The joy of love. Bishops from around the world read differently into the Pope's letter Amoris Laetitia. We'll delve into the debate. And play ball. Republicans and Democrats come together at an annual charity baseball game, days after the shooting of Representative Steve Scalise. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, June 16, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. Is the leader of ISIS dead? That's what Russia is claiming after a targeted airstrike. The Russian Defense Ministry claims Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in a Russian strike in late May, along with other senior group commanders. The spokesman for the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition says he could not confirm the claim. If confirmed, it would mark a major military success for Russia and a major blow for the terror group. The Pentagon is making plans to send 4,000 more American troops to Afghanistan to break a stalemate in the war. A Trump administration official tells the AP the decision by Defense Secretary James Mattis could be announced as early as next week. Mattis told senators this week, "We are not winning the war right now." President Trump is fulfilling one of his campaign promises. He's stopping a never-implemented Obama-era immigration program intended to protect parents, of U.S. citizens from deportation. The program was blocked by a federal judge after 26 states sued. Republicans say it's a backdoor amnesty program. President Trump announces he's making changes to the U.S.-Cuba policy put in place by his predecessor, changes he says are aimed at stopping the flow of cash from America to Cuba's military. Correspondent Mark Irons is following the story and reports from the White House. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. President Trump announced the rollback in Miami at a theater named after a famous Cuban who tried to topple the Castro regime. The president says Cuba secured far too many concessions in a deal made by the Obama administration that Trump calls misguided. He says he's closing the loopholes left by the Obama administration, which he believes have further benefited the Cuban military and the oppression of the Cuban people. President Trump stops short of a complete reversal, but revises Barack Obama's 2015 diplomatic re-engagement with Cuba.
And now that I am your president, America will expose the crimes of the Castro regime.
Trump's goal is to halt the flow of U.S. cash to the country's military. His new policy enhances travel restrictions and prohibits individual travel. U.S. airlines and cruise ships will still be allowed to service the island, and the U.S. Embassy in Cuba will remain open. Cuban migrants who make it onto U.S. soil are not allowed to stay, a policy put into place by President Obama. The president says the U.S. will not lift sanctions on Cuba until all political prisoners are freed, freedoms of assembly and expression are respected, all political parties are legalized, and free and internationally supervised elections are scheduled. Trump is challenging the Cuban government to negotiate a better deal than the one struck by Obama.
The previous administration's easing of restrictions on travel and trade does not help the Cuban people. They only enrich the Cuban regime.
But not all Americans agree. One tourist visiting the island this week thinks he's helping the Cuban people.
It's been, I believe, a great opportunity for the people living here to meet Americans and, to help support the economy.
In 2015, Pope Francis visited the island nation before his visit to the U.S. and played an important role in the warming of relations between Cuba and the U.S. under the Obama administration. The Vatican has supported opening U.S.-Cuba relations, believing that the U.S. trade embargo against Cuba is unjust. Wyatt?
Mark, Catholics have been persecuted in Cuba under the communist regime for nearly 60 years. Will this policy help Catholics and people of faith?
A senior White House official tells me the president wants to work on human rights and help Cubans who are looking for religious and political liberty. I'm told the president's Cuba policy will align with that goal. Wyatt?
Hopefully so. Correspondent Mark Irons at the White House. Thanks, Mark. Before Fidel Castro assumed power in Cuba, 85% of the country's population was Catholic, according to the CIA. But Castro expelled priests, closed Catholic schools, and viewed the church as an enemy. Many Cuban Americans who were Catholic fled the country for the United States. Joining us now is Dr. Grazie Christie, Policy Advisor for the Catholic Association. Dr. Christie is a regular guest on our show and the daughter of Cuban exiles. Dr. Christie, the Castro regime has persecuted Catholics on the island for decades. As a Cuban-American Catholic, what do you think of President Trump's shift in policy today?
We were very excited to find a real expression from an American president of the terrible human rights abuses that are going on to this day, in fact, worse since Obama's opening to Cuba, especially that of religious liberty. As a Catholic, I have a lot of friends that have arrived from Cuba recently. The oppression is worse than ever on any religion, any person who tries to practice a religion in Cuba, but especially Christians and Catholics.
You live in Miami, home to the largest Cuban-American community in the country. How is the community reacting?
I was just down at this theater where Mr. Trump made his announcement. There were a lot of homegrown supporters with their homemade signs, and a lot of excitement about hearing the abuses on the island being pointed out forthrightly by Mr. Trump.
President Trump says he wants to hold the Castro regime accountable, but Pope Francis has encouraged the U.S. to open up dialogue. Can they do both?
Why not? I think we can totally do both. We can dialogue and ask that the people of Cuba be given a little bit of the human rights that they deserve just for being human.
One of the new restrictions includes tighter rules for non-Cuban Americans traveling to the island, and critics argue this will negatively impact regular Cubans who work in the travel industry. Doesn't it help if Americans travel to the island and spend money?
You know, most of the money that tourists spend in Cuba are spent at the official hotels of Cuba, which are run by the government, and all that money is pocketed by the regime. Very little is given to the employees. Every Cuban in Cuba can only make up to $23 a month by law, and that's not enough to keep body and soul together.
Dr. Grazie Christie, Policy Advisor for the Catholic Association, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
President Trump confirms he's under investigation for firing FBI Director James Comey. It comes as the president takes aim at those looking into Russia's possible connections to the Trump campaign. The president writes, after 7 months of investigations and committee hearings about my collusions with the Russians, nobody has been able to show any proof. Sad. The Washington Post reports the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, may be a subject of the investigation into Russian meddling. The paper says Kushner's business dealings are now being investigated by Justice Department Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Doctors say House Majority Whip Steve Scalise is still in critical condition and will require more operations after being shot on Wednesday. But his surgeon says he has improved. Last night, his congressional colleagues paid tribute to him at their annual charity baseball game. On a warm Thursday night, baseball fans crowded the stands to witness a rare moment of bipartisanship on the field. The congressional game at Nationals Park in Washington pit Democrats and Republicans against each other. But this night was about so much more than the box score. President Trump taped a video message for the players and fans calling for unity.
You are showing the world that we will not be intimidated by threats, acts of violence, or assaults on our democracy. The game will go on.
And leaders from both parties calling for less heated rhetoric.
We have our political arguments, but at the end of the day, we're all Americans. And I think everybody needs to remember that because we're all in this thing together.
We have a responsibility to try to find common ground. If we can't, we stand our ground.
On Wednesday morning, a gunman attacked the Republican practice field, shooting 5 people, including Majority Whip Steve Scalise, who is a pro-life Catholic. Perhaps the highlight of the night, when Capitol Police Officer David Bailey, who helped thwart the attack, threw out the first pitch. In a city known for bruising partisan battles, at least for one night, there was really just one team on the field. In the end, the Democrats won in an 11-2 blowout, but Representative Scalise is the real winner. The Democrats gave the trophy to the Republicans so they could put it in Scalise's office. More than $1 million was raised for charity at the game. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us now. Jason, what's next for lawmakers?
Why, next week, Congress will get back to work on some pretty thorny issues like health care reform and the Russian probe. But last night's baseball game gave them the chance to combat the toxic climate here at the Capitol. One of the most touching images for me, seeing the players joining together in prayer by House Chaplain Father Pat Conroy. But the question is, will this bipartisan unity last? The co-chair of the Civility Caucus, Missouri Democrat Emanuel Cleaver, tells me it will take a lot of work.
Since the shooting, members have been extremely cordial to each other. But I've seen this play before, and it will continue. We'll continue to do that. It'll be cyclical. You know, bad incident, good behavior, and then we drift back into the old ways. And I think the reason that happens is that we're dealing only with surface change, and surface change will never become permanent.
Representative Cleaver suggests having congressmen of both parties and their families go on retreat together. He says they should draft a list of things they promise not to do. The shooting has also raised a slew of questions about protecting members of Congress and their staffs. Only congressional leaders like Steve Scalise have security with them at all times. And why, adding to the worries, a number of lawmakers have received death threats in recent months.
Jason, what is being done to keep the lawmakers safe?
Well, we're seeing a number of proposals, including having local police guard public events for the lawmakers back home. We're also seeing calls to increase the budget so they can have more security for lawmakers. And we're also seeing one Republican at least say he's going to take his security into his own hands, literally, by carrying a gun back home.
Correspondent Jason Calvi reporting from Capitol Hill. Thanks, Jason. A deacon at Representative Scalise's home parish in Louisiana spoke to us earlier today about the overwhelming support the church and the House Majority Whip have received since the shooting.
It really kind of blew me away just how much the parish community at St. Catherine's, felt the need to come together and pray for their fellow parishioner and really support each other at this time.
Deacon David says within just a few hours of the shooting, hundreds of people showed up for a prayer service at the church. A fraternity brother of Representative Scalise is organizing a blood drive with help from the Knights of Columbus. Adrian Bruno says he has known Scalise for 25 years and set up a drive at his local KFC council. He's now hoping for a national effort. A suicide bomber strikes outside a mosque in the Afghan capital of Kabul late last night, killing 4 people. Police say the bomber tried to force his way inside, but was stopped by a police officer who died in the blast. Kabul has been hit by violence in recent weeks. The worst attack in Afghanistan's 16-year war took place at the end of May. More than 150 people were killed when a massive truck bomb exploded. Grief in London over a high-rise tower fire that killed at least 30 people is turning to outrage. It comes after reports the materials used in a recent renovation of the public housing project may have fueled the inferno. London police have launched an investigation to determine whether any crimes contributed to the blaze. The bishops of Poland are the first to declare that the Pope's letter Amoris Laetitia, or the Joy of Love, must be read in continuity with the Church's teaching on giving the sacraments to divorced and to civilly remarried without an annulment, but not all bishops agree. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us now. Edward, what is the problem here and how serious is it?
Okay, the problem, well, it really goes back to Christ's teaching, which the Church has held for 2 millennia, which is that someone who divorces their spouse and remarries commits adultery. That's been unchanged for 2 millennia, but now with Amoris Laetitia, there's been varying interpretations of this, and some bishops' conferences, such as Belgium, Malta and Germany, are saying that in some cases divorced and remarried couples can receive Holy Communion, even if they're possibly living in an objective state of adultery. That's now been the development, but there's been other bishops' conferences, such as Poland, for example, which says that simply is not the case, and that the Church's teaching remains the same, and the Church's practice on this. So there's varying interpretations, and a certain, what some people call a doctrinal anarchy developing, where you've got different interpretations on a key part of Church teaching, depending on where you live, depending which bishop's conference you come under.
It is such a contentious issue. What should be done to resolve it?
It really that goes back to the Holy Father, because there's this lack of clarity on what actually Amoris Laetitia teaches on this. There's been various interpretations, and what various people, particularly the four so-called dubia cardinals, Cardinals Burke, Brandmüller, Meisner and Kafara, what they're asking for is for the Pope to be clear about this and whether really there is any change in Church's teaching, or whether this teaching remains absolute and that divorced and remarried couples cannot receive Holy Communion.
How likely is it that this debate will be settled?
Well, it really depends on whether the Holy Father does answer these five dubia that the cardinals have presented to him last year in order to bring that clarity. There is a great concern because there's this obvious confusion among many priests particularly about how they should deal with this, but also some priests have even, I've heard, left the ministry because of it, because they don't want to give Holy Communion to divorced and remarried couples because it goes against their conscience. So I think there is an urgency here, and many people feel great concern and a great wish that the Holy Father answers the dubia and brings clarity to the issue.
Okay, well, we continue to follow this issue and see if that clarity comes out. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks, Edward.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Pope Francis will celebrate the Feast of Corpus Christi this Sunday. The feast honors the belief of the body and blood of Jesus Christ's presence in the Eucharist. We will be streaming the Mass, procession, and benediction live on our EWTN News Nightly Facebook page Sunday. It will start around 1 p.m. Eastern. Coming up, 2 escaped inmates wanted in the killings of 2 guards are back behind bars. We'll tell you where they were found. Plus, coming together after a tragedy. After this week's congressional shooting, we take a look at civility in public discourse. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. 2 escaped inmates wanted in the killings of 2 prison guards in Georgia are back behind bars. Donnie Rowe and Ricky DuBose were captured last night in rural Tennessee. The suspects are accused of overpowering the guards, then shooting them while on a prison bus Tuesday. Both escapees were serving sentences for armed robbery and other crimes. A hearing is scheduled next week on a lawsuit seeking to stop the government from deporting more than 100 mostly Chaldean Christian Iraqis. The ACLU filed the lawsuit yesterday in a Detroit federal court against the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE says all have criminal convictions. Republicans and Democrats came together after the shooting at a GOP baseball practice that left Majority Whip Steve Scalise in critical condition. But it didn't last long. Yesterday, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi blasted conservative lawmakers for suggesting the rhetoric from the left was in some way to blame for the attack.
I think that the comments made by my Republican colleagues are outrageous, beneath the dignity of the job that they hold, beneath the dignity of the respect that we would like Congress to command. How dare they say such a thing? How dare they?
We should point out that the gunman, James Hodgkinson, was a Bernie Sanders supporter. He also had posted a number of anti-Republican and anti-Trump comments on social media. One of his recent Facebook posts said, "It's time to destroy Trump and company." Dr. Robert George is a professor at Princeton University and the founder of the American Principles Project. Dr. George, you've taught a class with your friend and colleague Cornel West at Princeton. He's known for being more on the leftist side in terms of politics, but you make it a point that people can interact, have good relationship, and work on their political differences together. How do you get that message across, though, to politicians in Washington where things are so divisive?
Well, it's going to be a challenge, but it's a challenge that we're going to have to meet. Things could spin out of control very quickly and very badly here in the United States. We are much too polarized. The language is much too vitriolic, and people are already resorting to violence. We've seen it on our college campuses. We've seen it at Middlebury. We've seen it at Berkeley. This could become worse than a cold civil war. This could end up in a situation in which people are doing what Mr. Hodgkinson tried to do to Republican members of Congress a couple of days ago. Right. Shooting, murder. So we're just going to have to get there. In my 32 years of teaching at Princeton, Wyatt, nothing has been more enjoyable or I think important than the teaching I've done with Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West and I, as you say, are at opposite sides in the, of the political spectrum, and yet we both believe deeply in the inherent dignity of the human person, and that means we treat each other with respect despite our differences, that we listen to each other, that we recognize that neither of us is infallible. Both of us are capable of being wrong about something or anything, so we need to engage each other in a spirit of civility and openness. We need to be willing to learn from each other. Now, I'm a Republican, but I don't imagine that the Republicans are right on everything and the Democrats are wrong on everything. I think Democrats are wrong on some pretty important things: pro-life, marriage, religious liberty. But there's no guarantee from God that the Republicans are always going to be right and the Democrats are always going to be wrong. And I would hope that folks on the Democratic side would adopt exactly the same attitude. Now, Mrs. Pelosi's rhetoric here is not helping, but I hope that people will adopt the same attitude, recognizing that they too have something to learn from people on the Republican or the conservative side. They need to be open, they need to listen, they need to engage, as Professor West does. Now, Professor West has set a model for people on the left. I hope I've set something of a model for people on the conservative side.
Well, Dr. George, here really quickly, just give me your assessment of what you think about young people right now. Do they tend to be as hyper-polarized, or do they tend to be more open to this kind of dialogue?
I'm afraid things have gone in the wrong direction, and it's not their fault. Well, it's partially their fault. We have to hold to individual responsibility. But they've received a lot of bad lessons from older people. I mean, look at what Mrs. Pelosi was saying there. That sets a bad example for young people. And there are people on the conservative side who've also set a bad example with vitriolic rhetoric and denouncing other people and personal attacks and so forth. So we see on our campuses today so often, from Middlebury to Claremont to Yale to University of Missouri to Berkeley, students who are unwilling to listen to people who disagree with them. They denounce them as bigots and haters. They stigmatize and marginalize them. They shout them down. They seek to get them disinvited if they're invited to speak on campus. That's no good. That's a very bad attitude. It's deeply contrary to the spirit of learning, number one, and number two, it is simply toxic for democratic citizenship.
Toxic's a great way to describe it. Dr. Robert George, professor at Princeton University, thanks so much for talking with us about it.
Thanks so much, Wyatt.
Up next, some scientists are proposing using brain cells from aborted babies for Parkinson's research. We ask one expert about what ethical methods can be used instead.
Siamo tribulati, siamo sconvolti, siamo perseguitati.
Pope Francis calls on the faithful to accept we are weak and in need of God's healing. The Holy Father reflected on St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians during Mass at his residence. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. There's still no cure for Parkinson's disease. About 1 million Americans suffer from it. It's a progressive brain disorder that affects movement. Research scientists now want to revive a previous treatment that involved aborted baby brain cells. Dr. David Prentice is Vice President and Research Director of the Charlotte Lozier Institute. David, scientists are hoping to revive a treatment for people with Parkinson's disease. An NPR report says they're planning to resume tests for baby body parts, baby brain cells. Why did they stop with this in the first place, and why are they resuming?
Well, the reason they stopped, Wyatt, is because it didn't work before. In fact, a lot of the patients were harmed. There was a report in 2001 and then again in 2003, large controlled studies. The 2001 report made the cover of the New York Times, and they described the patients as writhing, jerking uncontrollably. They're putting these baby brain cells into the brains of the patients. 3 to 4 babies needed for every patient treatment. And they're trying to replace the cells that make a chemical called dopamine to stop the problems you see with Parkinson's. Well, they can't control it. And so they stopped because they were getting these problems and all of these adverse events with the patients. Well, they seem to think now that they have refined the technique such that they'll be able to control it. I'm very skeptical. In fact, even some members of the groups that are planning to do that are skeptical. It's not a very good way to proceed.
It doesn't seem very ethical at all. Are there any ethical use of stem cells, or are all stem cells bad?
Not all stem cells are bad. Adult stem cells are very good. In fact, there was a report back in 2009 where they had used a patient's own brain stem cells, adult stem cells. The patient went for almost 5 years with no symptoms of Parkinson's. There's a trial that will start soon in Houston using bone marrow-derived adult stem cells. Again, very promising science coming, but totally ethical. Nobody has to die to get these particular adult stem cells.
It's interesting when you think about the doctors who are working on this particular new research, they have their own financial stake in this project. In your experience, at what stage of a medical research project does money sort of interfere with ethics?
Well, unfortunately, it interferes at various points. Certainly at the beginning, because they need money to even start these projects. But they're also looking ahead, hoping to make lots of money because they want to be able to treat lots of patients and essentially make this a prescription that someone might write. So there's an incentive at the beginning, and then they're looking down the road for, hopefully, they think, more economic success.
Dr. David Prentice, Vice President of Research for the Charlotte Lozier Institute. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Tonight on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly, Catherine Zeltner looks back at her top interviews so far this year, including Sister Constance on the Little Sisters of the Poor's new initiative to bring young people to prayer.
Today, because families live so dispersed across the country, you know, a lot of kids might not have regular contact with their own grandparents, and so they don't really have an experience of older people.
Sister Constance says interaction between different generations is key for our culture. You can see more of Catherine's interview tonight on Pro-Life Weekly. It airs at 11 p.m. Eastern right here on EWTN and re-airs on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. We thank you for joining us this week. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We hope you have a safe weekend. Good night and God bless.